Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with BassFishingHQ, and today we're going to talk a little bit about fishing Hydrilla. So when it comes to fishing Hydrilla, Hydrilla is an aquatic weed. It's actually an invasive weed that comes from who knows where, who knows how any of these aquatic vegetation gets in our water systems, but it is an invasive species. A lot of times you're going to find that they actually spray to keep Hydrilla down, but the fact of the matter is Hydrilla is a bass magnet. Okay, and so we're going to talk a little bit about not only fishing Hydrilla and how to fish it, but what kind of places to look for, and what actually does the best looking Hydrilla look like. Okay, so let's actually start there. Right, so one of the biggest things that you want to look for when you're looking to fish Hydrilla is the best looking Hydrilla. And what I mean by that is you're looking for grass. I'm going to call it grass sometimes interchangeably, but you're going to look for Hydrilla that is extremely green, right? Sometimes you'll be fishing Hydrilla and you're going to see that sometimes it almost has like a reddish hue to it or a brownish tint. A lot of times that's not the best stuff. What you really like to find is what you would call crispy green Hydrilla, right? And that represents Hydrilla that's kind of older, that's kind of established, that's been there, and it's very healthy. Typically what you're gonna find in areas that have that type of Hydrilla is clean water. So a lot of times that's, again, a big magnet for bass, right? Because that Hydrilla is shelter for not only bass, but for bluegill and shiners and shad and all those types of bait fish, and that is why you find big bass in Hydrilla. So a couple of ways to fish Hydrilla, kind of what you want to look for is typically something that's a little bit different, right? The thing about Hydrilla is it can grow so thick that bass actually cannot get in it. So that's really important to remember, because sometimes you can be fishing Hydrilla and you're literally not fishing around bass because it's so thick and dense that bass can't actually get in it. You know, unlike, you know, other types of grasses, for instance, like milfoil or even water willow that grows along the bank, you know, bass can typically get in that stuff. So all you really have to do is put a bait inside that grass and you're going to get bit. Now, Hydrilla, again, it can grow super duper thick, like super thick that you can't even get anything through it. Bass can't get in it. So one of the biggest things that I like to look for when I'm fishing Hydrilla is a clean edge. A lot of times you'll see this in lakes that, you know, I've seen it in Lake Chickamauga, I've seen it in Lake Toho, any type of lake. Obviously a lot of Texas lakes have Hydrilla as well. But if you can find an edge where that Hydrilla just stops growing, you know, it may be in 8 foot of water, it may be in 10 foot of water, it may be in 15 foot of water, because Hydrilla does grow deep. But if you can find an edge where basically you have almost a wall of Hydrilla, a lot of times you're going to find bass that sit right on that edge. And if you can find something like a point that is on that wall of Hydrilla, that's even a better area. Even another better area yet is if you can find a hard bottom that leads right up to that Hydrilla line. So for instance, a lot of places down south, what you'll find is shell beds. And these shell beds will actually grow and they'll make a hard bottom. And where that butts up right up against the Hydrilla, that is a bass magnet. And I'm telling you, you can catch tons of fish in those type of areas. So again, look for an edge. A clean edge is one great area. Another great area that you want to look for or look at when you're finding Hydrilla is individual clumps. You know, a lot of times what you'll find is you'll find these areas where basically you have an edge or a wall of Hydrilla, but just off of that you'll find these individual kind of all by themselves clumps of Hydrilla. And again, those can be extremely great places to find bass, because then a lot of times that's where you're going to find some big bass, right? Because they're all by themselves and they're kind of off the beaten path. A lot of guys may be able to visually see an edge, but sometimes they can't see those clumps that are off of the edge where you can catch a lot of bass. And sometimes a small clump, I mean, it could be the size of your bass boat, can really hold a lot of fish. And so I typically like to find the clumps that grow pretty high, right? So if you're fishing 8-10 foot of water, say, if you find those clumps that are growing within a foot or so of the surface, those can sometimes be the best clumps. I really like those thick clumps, right? So that's two ways, two areas to look for when you're fishing hydrilla, right? A third thing is, a lot of times what you're gonna find is you might be fishing a flat that's, say for instance, like 4 to 6 foot deep, and you're just gonna find hydrilla that's just starting to come up. It may be 2 or 3 foot tall, and basically you're gonna be able to fish over the hydrilla, right? It may be just kind of a patchy area where there's clumps here and there. They don't come all the way to the surface. Those are also great areas to find bass. Definitely in the pre-spawn can be great areas. A lot of times in the summertime, all those clumps are going to be solid to the top, to the surface. So a lot of times on pre-spawn, I'm looking for that hydrilla that's just starting to come up. It may only be 2, 3, 4 foot high, and those bass are actually going to hang right above it. So those are also great areas to find hydrilla. And then the fourth place that I look to catch bass and hydrilla is actually looking for matted hydrilla. So a lot of times this is actually hydrilla that has been chopped completely off of its original stock, and it has blown into, say, a pad field or into some reeds or wherever it may be, where it's actually collected and it's floating on the surface. That is a phenomenal area to catch big bass, right? Because you've created a mat, you've created a roof of hydrilla, and those fish will sit right under it. They sit in the shade and they just wait for little, clueless bluegill to come by and boom, bam, they nail them, right? So again, that's a great way, and the fourth way to kind of fish hydrilla. So the biggest thing, again, that I've noticed when you're fishing hydrilla is really trying to decipher where the fish are in it. Are they on the bottom near it? Like we talked about, fishing the edge, fishing the clumps. Are they suspended in it? Like I said earlier, they may be 4 or 5 foot high in 7 foot of water, and they're just above the hydrilla. Recently, I just fished the Bassmaster Open, and I actually find a lot of hydrilla growing in 9 foot of water, and it grew within about a foot to a foot and a half of the surface. And believe it or not, I caught several fish that were sitting in that foot and a half of water, over 9 foot of water, and they were actually on top of the hydrilla, right on the edge. That's a great place. So what you really want to do is just try to figure out where exactly the bass are in the hydrilla, how they are relating to it. Okay, so with that being said, there's only a few baits that are really, when I'm trying to find bass in the hydrilla, I start out with basically these 3 lures that I'm going to show you right now, and after that is when I start to kind of fork off into different lures. So for instance, let's just talk about the first one, right? One of the best baits that will ever be thrown in hydrilla and continues to produce is the good old standard chatterbait, right? A jackhammer, the original chatterbait, they all work, right? And this is a great bait because it comes through grass very effectively and very clean, right? If I get it hung up in the grass, I can snap it and it's gonna come free, right? This is a great bait because I can also cover a ton of water columns. A lot of people think that you just, fish a chatterbait horizontally through the water column, but a lot of times I'll yo-yo this in the hydrilla itself. I'll let it purposely get hung, I'll rip it out and let it fall, and bam, that's when you're gonna create that reaction strike and catch more fish, right? So this is a great way of covering water in hydrilla and finding out exactly, hey, are these fish sitting up in that first foot of water? You can let it go all the way down to the bottom in 8-9 foot. It's a little bit harder to fish that way, but you can do it. They have chatterbaits now that are 3/4 of an ounce, even a 1 ounce, that you can kind of get deep, and that's a great bait, a great search tool to find fish, right? So that's going to be a lot of times how I start, because I can cover a lot of water. One of the old standby best ways that I really like to fish, probably one of my favorite ways, is just a big worm of some sort. Whether that's a ribbon tail worm, or whether that's for instance, this is a Zoom Magnum trick worm. This is one of the best baits, and one of the best baits to catch big fish in hydrilla. I absolutely love fishing this bait. just like this. I typically am going to use a 1/4 ounce to maybe a 3/8 ounce weight. Sometimes I'll peg it, sometimes I won't. Sometimes, believe it or not, it's a lot better actually to leave it unpegged. And then what happens is when that bait is unpegged, that weight will fall a little bit, and the actual bait will follow it very slowly down, and that slow kind of fall down really can trigger a lot of fish. So keep that in mind when you're fishing hydrilla. I really like to fish this particular bait when I'm fishing around those edges or those individual clumps, right? So what I'll do is I'll actually, if I'm fishing an edge of hydrilla, I'll cast this worm right up on top of the hydrilla, and I'll slowly pull it off the edge and let it go down to where that hydrilla hits the bottom, where you have that clean edge, right? Because a lot of times you're gonna find out that the bass are sitting, like I said earlier, if they're sitting up on top of the hydrilla, or they're suspended in it, in which in that case they'll hit it on the way down, or sometimes they'll be on the bottom and you'll fish it on the bottom. The best thing about a worm though is you can really coerce a big school of fish all on a worm sometimes that's just sitting there in the hydrilla. They may be in a very tight specific spot. So sometimes, for instance, if I'm casting a chatterbait around, I catch a bass on it, I will actually then go and throw this worm in that exact same spot. And like I said, sometimes you'll find big schools of bass in a small area. So the last, but definitely not least, and maybe one of my favorite, I love all these ways, but maybe one of my favorite ways to catch bass in hydrilla is, like I said, finding those individual hydrilla mats that you can go throw a big weight and actually punch right through that mat. And that's what we got here. Of course, my bait, my line's all tangled up. Okay, so what we got here is, this is 1 1/4 ounce weight. I typically like a smaller bait when I'm doing this. This is a Gambler BB Cricket. It's one of my favorite mat baits to fish. This is just gonna allow you to punch through that thick mat real easily. And then you just start the process of yo-yoing it. And believe it or not, I probably yo-yo this more than most people do, especially at the start. For instance, if I'm finding a lot of mats, I'll yo-yo this bait 10, 12, 15 times. And a lot of times, especially nowadays when there's so much pressure on the water, a lot of times just yo-yoing that bait up and down is going to get a bass interested. And one thing to do is, more times than not, you are gonna have fish that just bite that bait as soon as it falls through the mat, right? But what I like to do a lot of times is actually bring the bait up to the top of the roof of that mat and yo-yo it just below that mat. Because sometimes what you find is bass are suspended right below the mat, and when you're yo-yoing it just below the mat, you're gonna get those bass that are suspended right below the mat to take it actually off the roof of the mat and bring it down. So those are my 3 baits that I am going to typically start with, at least when I'm fishing hydrilla. Another good one is a rattle trap or a lipless crankbait of some sort. That's a great bait as well. But anyways, those are the ones that I start with. From there, I venture out though. You know, a lot of times I'll have a jerk bait rigged up to fish hydrilla, a lipless crankbait, like I said. Sometimes a square bill crankbait is something a little bit different that they haven't seen. That I really like to throw. Sometimes slow rolling a big spinner bait is a great way to fish hydrilla, and also different types of worms. You know, a ribbon tail is a great way to, kind of in that post spawn to summertime, I'm typically going to throw a ribbon tail worm into the hydrilla, but in that pre-spawn or winter time, I like that big straight tail. So those are kind of the things that I like to do when I'm fishing hydrilla. Again, look for differences in the hydrilla. One that I didn't actually mention, and I'm going to mention now, it's kind of a bonus one, right? Is if you find those areas that look like the hydrilla is basically choked out, you know, maybe it's a 5-6 foot flat and it's all the way to the top the whole way. Make sure you look visually and even idle through that, because sometimes what you'll find is you'll find a hole. You'll find just a blank hole in that hydrilla, and it may only be the size of this garage, or it may be very small. But typically when you have a hole in an area that's almost choked out of hydrilla, what you have is some sort of hard bottom that doesn't allow hydrilla to grow. That is a dynamite spot. I mean, a dynamite spot to find bass, because a lot of times those areas can be hard to find, and because all that area is choked out and you have this one little spot that is a hard bottom, those fish are going to use that little hole and that hard bottom to actually feed. So it's going to be like a table for those fish to feed. So look out for those areas. Use those lures whenever you're fishing hydrilla next. Check those things out, all right? And you're going to be successful. Again, the biggest thing you want to try to figure out, where are the fish located in the hydrilla? Are they suspended? Are they on top of it? Are they sitting at the bottom? And then from there, just start fishing. You know, sometimes the best way to pick apart hydrilla, obviously I'm going to idle a lot of it to try to find those sweet spots, to try to find those edges, those individual clumps, or to find the points in the grass or the holes in the grass. But sometimes you just got to break out a chatterbait or a lipless crankbait and just start casting around. And sometimes you'll find that there's just a school of bait in an area, and because that school of bait's there, there's a bunch of bass there. So use those tips and tricks the next time you're fishing hydrilla, and I hope it catches you not only some more bass, but obviously some bigger bass. So guys, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment below if you have a different way that you like to fish hydrilla. Comment below, let me know exactly how you like to do it. Let's start that conversation. All right, have a good one. See you in the next one.